I've been sitting on this story for years, and honestly I don't even know why I'm posting it now. Maybe it's guilt finally catching up. Maybe it's boredom. Maybe it's that I keep seeing "get rich in real estate" TikToks and feeling this familiar knot in my stomach. Either way, here it is. I'm William. This is about real estate fraud, one of several crimes I committed over my life, but the one that still wakes me up some nights. Not because it was the biggest or the most dangerous, but because it was the one where I felt the most normal while doing something deeply wrong. At the time, I wasn't some criminal mastermind. I was a mid-30s guy who'd failed upward just enough to look legitimate. I'd worked adjacent to real estate for years, paperwork, inspections, light consulting stuff. I knew the language, the rhythms, the way buyers trusted anyone who sounded confident and mildly exhausted. I also knew how desperate people were to believe they'd finally found the one. My motive wasn't cartoon villain greed. It was quieter and uglier than that, resentment and entitlement. I felt smarter than the agents I dealt with. I felt overlooked. I felt like the system was already rigged, so bending it didn't really count as breaking it. I told myself I was just taking advantage of inefficiencies, which is a fancy way of saying I wanted money without earning it the honest way. The circumstances lined up the way they always do in bad decisions, slowly, then all at once. A hot market. Buyers skipping due diligence. Agents juggling too many listings. And me, realizing there was a gap between what people assumed was being checked and what actually was. At first, it was just a thought experiment. Could someone get away with this? Kind of thing. Then it became, someone definitely is. And finally, the most dangerous thought of all. Why not me? That was the moment the story really started. Once the idea lodged itself in my head, I didn't rush it. That's something people misunderstand about crimes like this. They're rarely impulsive. They're slow, methodical, and wrapped in a layer of self-justification so thick you barely notice it forming. I spent weeks just watching. I paid attention to how listings were copied and reposted, how agents relied on prior documentation, how buyers skimmed disclosures like they were terms and conditions. I wasn't inventing a new scam. I was studying the cracks in a system that already assumed everyone was acting in good faith. My preparation looked boring from the outside. Coffee shops. Late nights at my laptop. Old emails. Archived listings. I refreshed myself on zoning jargon, inspection language, and the kind of phrases that made people stop asking questions. There's a cadence to professional confidence. Short sentences, mild annoyance, the implication that you've already explained this 100 times before. I also rehearsed my own role. That part surprised me. I practiced sounding helpful but busy, knowledgeable but not pushy. I adjusted my online presence just enough to look established without drawing attention. Nothing flashy. Flashy gets noticed. Boring gets trusted. The scariest part was how calm I felt. No racing heart, no moral panic. Just a steady sense of control. I remember thinking, if I'm this comfortable planning it, maybe it's not that bad. That's a lie your brain tells you when it wants something badly enough. By the time I was done preparing, it didn't feel like I was about to commit a crime. It felt like I was about to execute a plan. And plans, once you've invested enough time in them, start to feel inevitable. This is the part where it stops being abstract and starts being real. Up until then, everything lived in my head or on a screen. The moment I chose a specific property, a specific transaction, it crossed an invisible line. I remember hovering over my mouse, thinking, once I click this, I'm not just thinking anymore. I picked the target carefully, not because it was flashy, but because it was messy. A property that had changed hands a few times, had a long paper trail, minor inconsistencies no one had bothered to clean up. Nothing dramatic. Just enough ambiguity to hide in. The kind of listing where everyone assumes someone else already verified the important stuff. The buyers were exactly who you'd expect in a hot market, eager, stretched thin, terrified of missing out. The agent was overworked, juggling calls, trusting digital documents and verbal confirmations because that's how deals moved fast. No villains there. Just people doing what the system trained them to do. What really sealed it for me was how easy it felt to insert myself. I didn't have to force my way in. I just showed up. Answered questions. Provided context. Sounded like someone who belonged. No one challenged it, because nothing about me triggered alarm bells. That night, I didn't celebrate. I didn't panic either. I slept like someone who'd finally made a decision after weeks of indecision. That should have scared me more than it did. Looking back, that's the moment I became the kind of person who could do this. Not when money changed hands, not when lies were told, but when I chose a real person to lie to and didn't back out. This was the part where theory met reality, and I had to actually do something. Up until now, I'd been hiding behind observation and plausibility. But a plan doesn't mean anything until you introduce friction, people asking questions, documents moving around, timelines tightening. That's when I had to start lying out loud, not just in my head. I inserted myself into the process the way I always had, as a helpful intermediary. Someone who knew the history of the property. Someone who could clarify things that didn't quite line up on paper. I never claimed to be more than I was. That was important. Big lies attract scrutiny. Small, confident omissions don't. The first time I sent information that I knew was misleading, but not obviously false, I felt a jolt go through me. Not panic. Something closer to electricity. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute before I clicked it. Once it was gone, there was no taking it back. What surprised me was how quickly the lie became normal. People responded with thanks. With trust. With follow-up questions that assumed I was operating in good faith. Every reply reinforced the idea that I was playing my role correctly. There were moments I expected resistance. A raised eyebrow. Hang on, that doesn't sound right. It never came. Instead, I got relief. People were happy someone seemed to know what was going on. That's when I realized the real danger wasn't being caught. It was how easy it was to convince myself that I wasn't really hurting anyone. Not yet, anyway. Once things were in motion, they didn't slow down, they sped up. That's another thing no one tells you about this kind of crime. After the first lie, the rest feel less like choices and more like obligations. I wasn't waking up thinking, how do I scam these people today? I was waking up thinking, I have to keep this consistent, or it falls apart. Emails started stacking up. Calls came in at inconvenient times. I'd answer while grocery shopping, while driving, while half asleep. I stayed calm on the outside, because calm is contagious. If you sound unbothered, people assume everything is fine. There were moments where I had to improvise, minor discrepancies, timing issues, questions I hadn't anticipated. Each time, I felt that familiar spike of adrenaline, followed by relief when the explanation landed. It was addictive in a way I still don't like admitting. Not the money, the control. The feeling that I could steer a situation just by choosing the right words. I also started noticing how invested everyone else was. The buyers were emotionally attached already, talking about future plans, renovations, schools. Hearing that should have stopped me. Instead, I compartmentalized it. I told myself they'd be fine. People like them always land on their feet, right? By then, backing out felt impossible. Not because I'd be exposed immediately, but because I'd have to admit, to myself most of all, that I'd crossed a line for nothing. So I kept going. Not boldly. Just steadily. One response, one reassurance at a time. The first real problem didn't come from the buyers. It came from paperwork. There was a document, just one, that didn't line up the way I expected it to. Nothing dramatic, but enough that it couldn't be smoothed over with vague language. Dates didn't quite match. A signature looked off. The kind of thing that wouldn't matter unless someone stopped to really look at it. And someone did. I got an email late in the evening from an agent I hadn't dealt with much. Polite. Neutral. A couple of clarifying questions. The kind of message that looks harmless but makes your stomach drop because you can tell they're actually paying attention. I reread it about 10 times, drafting responses in my head and deleting them before typing anything. For the first time since this started, I felt fear, not abstract fear of consequences someday, but the immediate kind. The this could unravel right now kind. What I sent back was technically an answer, but not a direct one. I referenced older records. I blamed outdated files. I used phrases like, "to my knowledge," and, "as far as I'm aware." It bought me time, which is what I needed more than anything. Still, after that exchange, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room had gotten quieter. Like people weren't suspicious yet, but they were listening differently. And once people start listening, confidence alone doesn't always save you. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I was sure I'd be caught, but because I realized how fragile the whole thing really was. One person doing their job too well was all it took. After that email, something shifted in me. A sane person might have taken it as a warning sign, an exit ramp. I took it as a challenge. That's the ugly truth. Once fear fades a little, it mutates into stubbornness. I told myself I'd already come too far, that pulling out now would only draw more attention. That finishing the deal cleanly was somehow less harmful than leaving loose ends behind. It's amazing how morality bends when it's inconvenient. I became sharper, more alert. I reread everything before sending it. I kept mental timelines straight, corrected people gently when they misremembered details. I wasn't inventing new lies so much as reinforcing the old ones, patching cracks as they appeared. It felt like maintaining a structure under stress, constant pressure, constant vigilance. What I didn't expect was how isolating it became. I stopped talking to friends. I dodged family calls. Every conversation felt risky because my head was already full of other people's assumptions and expectations. I was living in a version of reality that only existed as long as I actively maintained it. There was a moment, standing in line somewhere mundane, I don't even remember where, when I realized I was rehearsing explanations for things no one had accused me of yet. That's when it hit me, even if I got away with it, I'd already lost something. Peace, maybe? Or the ability to be off-duty. But by then, the finish line was visible. Money was close. Paperwork was almost done. And I told myself what I'd been telling myself from the start, just get through this part. Then it's over. Everything bottlenecked at once. Deadlines tightened. People got jumpy. That calm, professional tone everyone had been using started to crack under the weight of money and time. Closing day has a way of doing that. It turns polite emails into clipped messages and friendly calls into interrogations disguised as small talk. I could feel the scrutiny increase, even if no one openly accused me of anything. Questions came faster. Responses were reread more carefully. I noticed longer pauses before replies, little shifts in phrasing that suggested people were double-checking instead of trusting. The worst part was how normal everything looked on the surface. Calendars filled. Documents circulated. Congratulations were pre-written. It created this bizarre cognitive dissonance. The more legitimate it appeared, the more terrified I became of being exposed at the last second. There was one call in particular I still remember clearly. A routine confirmation, nothing confrontational. The person on the other end was friendly, almost cheerful. But halfway through, they asked a follow-up question I hadn't anticipated, something small, technical, but specific. I paused. Just a second too long. In that pause, my mind went completely blank. No clever phrasing, no rehearsed explanation. Just a loud internal voice saying, "This is it. This is where it breaks." What came out of my mouth wasn't brilliant. It was just confident. I answered as if there were nothing unusual about the question, as if I'd answered it 100 times before. Silence on the line. Then a simple, "Okay, thanks." When the call ended, my hands were shaking. That was new. Up until then, fear had been distant, manageable. This was physical. Real. And it told me something I'd been avoiding. I wasn't in control anymore. I was just hoping no one pushed too hard in the wrong place. The day before everything was supposed to finalize was the closest I came to walking away, and the closest I came to being exposed. An issue surfaced that couldn't be brushed aside with confidence alone. A third-party verification flagged something that, in isolation, looked minor. In context, it was a thread. And if someone pulled it hard enough, the whole sweater came apart. I remember staring at my screen, rereading the message, feeling that cold, sinking pressure in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding I could redirect. This was someone asking for proof. The kind that either exists or doesn't. I spent hours scrambling, digging through old files, reconstructing timelines, crafting an explanation that leaned on complexity rather than clarity. When facts don't support you, confusion becomes a tool. I hated myself a little for how naturally it came to me. There was a brief confrontation, nothing dramatic, just a tense exchange where I could tell the other person wasn't fully convinced. They weren't accusing me, but they weren't comfortable either. And discomfort is dangerous. It makes people escalate. What saved me wasn't brilliance. It was exhaustion, theirs, not mine. End-of-day pressure. Too many deals. Too many moving parts. They deferred the issue, flagged it for follow-up if needed, and moved on. When the conversation ended, I felt hollow. Not relieved. Not triumphant. Just empty. I'd been holding my breath for so long that when I finally exhaled, there was nothing left in my lungs. That was the moment I realized how arbitrary it all was. Not justice. Not fairness. Just timing, workload, and luck. And the terrifying part? Luck was on my side. Closing day came and went without fireworks. No dramatic accusations. No last-minute rescues. Just signatures, confirmations, and the quiet hum of something irreversible happening in the background. I remember the exact moment the money hit. I wasn't celebrating. I was staring at my screen, refreshing like it might disappear if I looked away too long. When it didn't, when the numbers stayed put, my first thought wasn't I did it. It was so this is what it feels like. Not joy. Not triumph. Wait. Everything everyone had been talking about for weeks, the plans, the stress, the urgency, suddenly collapsed into this sterile, transactional endpoint. For them, it was the start of something new. For me, it was proof that the lie had solidified into reality. People sent polite thank you messages. Smiley faces. Professional gratitude. Each one landed like a quiet accusation, even though none of them knew what they were thanking me for. I replied in kind, careful not to overdo it. Normal to the end. That night, I went out and bought something small and unnecessary. Not as a reward, more as a test. Could I enjoy it? Could I feel like this was worth it? I couldn't. I kept thinking about how easily the money had moved, how permanent it suddenly felt. Before everything had been theoretical, risk, consequences. Someday. Now it was done. Locked in. And I understood something too late. Getting away with it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like being trapped in a version of yourself you can't undo. I slept that night, but not deeply. Every notification sound felt louder than it should have been. Every vibration made my heart jump. The crime was over, technically, but my body hadn't gotten the message yet. If you've never done something illegal and gotten away with it, at least temporarily, you probably imagine the relief is immediate. Like a storm passing. That wasn't my experience at all. The days after closing were worse than the days leading up to it. I kept waiting for the follow-up email. The quick question. The delayed realization that something didn't add up. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach tightened. I replayed conversations in my head, scanning for moments where I might have slipped, where someone could suddenly connect dots they hadn't even noticed before. Nothing happened. And that was unsettling. Life just continued. People moved on to the next deal, the next crisis, the next client. I realized how little permanence most transactions have in people's minds once they're done. That anonymity had protected me the whole time, and it was still protecting me now. I tried to act normal. Went back to routines. Answered casual. "How've you been?" Texts. But there was a constant background noise in my head, like static. I was hyper-aware of everything: sirens outside, official-looking envelopes, unknown numbers. At some point, the fear started to fade. Not completely, but enough that something else crept in: justification. I started reframing it in my mind. Telling myself no one had been directly hurt. That the system absorbed the damage. That this kind of thing happens all the time. Those thoughts scared me more than the fear did. Because fear keeps you cautious. Rationalization makes you reckless. A few months later, I heard about the first real consequence, not for me, but around me. Indirect. Secondhand. The kind of thing you only notice if you're listening for it. Someone mentioned delays. Extra inspections. A headache that should have been caught earlier. No accusations. No investigations. Just frustration. The system doing what it always does when something goes wrong, spreading the inconvenience thin enough that no single person can point to the source. I remember standing there, nodding sympathetically, feeling like a ghost at my own wake. That's when the guilt finally stopped being abstract. Up until then, it had been theoretical. I did a bad thing. Now it had texture. Real people adjusting plans. Stress rippling outward in ways I couldn't predict or control. I didn't confess. I didn't step in to fix anything. I justified my silence the same way I justified everything else. It was too late, it wouldn't help, it would only make things worse. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was just cowardice with better PR. What changed was how I saw myself. I'd always thought of criminals as people who crossed the line and became something else. Instead, I felt disturbingly unchanged. Same habits, same voice, same face in the mirror. The realization hit me hard. You don't turn into a bad person. You stay yourself and just carry the weight quietly. That weight didn't crush me. It just settled in, like sediment at the bottom of a glass. Out of sight, but always there if you shake things up. I thought the danger window had passed. That's what everyone says: the longer you go without consequences, the safer you are. That belief lasted right up until it didn't. Almost a year later, I got an email with a subject line so bland it made my heart stutter. A routine inquiry. A request for clarification related to an old transaction. That transaction. Time had softened the fear, but it hadn't erased it. The adrenaline came back instantly, like my body remembered before my brain did. This wasn't panic level yet, but it was close. The tone was neutral, professional, almost bored. That scared me more than anger would have. Anger means emotion. Emotion means mistakes. This was procedural. Someone following a checklist. I replied carefully. Truth adjacent, non-committal, framed as memory rather than fact. I didn't fabricate anything new, that felt too risky now. Instead, I leaned into uncertainty. Time, after all, is the best alibi. People forget details. Records get archived. Responsibility diffuses. A few back and forths later, the thread went quiet. No accusation. No escalation. Just silence again. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't before. Consequences don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they circle you, test the fence, and move on, not because you're innocent, but because you're inconvenient to deal with. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt smaller. Like I was living on borrowed indifference rather than earned freedom. After that last close call, something in me finally settled, not into peace, but into acceptance. Not the healthy kind. The kind where you stop expecting the other shoe to drop and start adjusting your posture so you can walk with one shoe heavier than the other. I didn't spend the money in any dramatic way. That's important to say. No sports cars, no trips, no sudden lifestyle shift. I buried it in normalcy, bills, savings, things that made it harder to distinguish from money I'd earned cleanly. That felt safer, but it also meant there was never a clean line between before and after. Just a slow blending. What changed most was how I interacted with people. I became hyper-aware of trust, how easily it's given, how casually it's assumed. Every time someone deferred to my opinion or thanked me for being straightforward, I felt a small internal flinch. Not enough to stop functioning, but enough to notice. I also stopped telling myself I'd never do something like that again. That life felt too fragile. Instead, I focused on not wanting to. I avoided situations where I'd have access, influence, or plausible deniability. It wasn't redemption. It was risk management. There were nights I'd replay the whole thing and try to pinpoint the exact moment I could have stepped off the path without blowing everything up. The answer was always the same: early. Before momentum. Before I'd invested my ego in seeing it through. Living with it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. And in some ways, that was the punishment. No closure, no reckoning, just the ongoing knowledge that I'd seen how easy it was, and that I'd said yes when it mattered. If you're looking for a clean moral ending, I don't really have one. I wasn't caught. I wasn't redeemed. Life didn't dramatically punish me or magically forgive me. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. What I learned is how thin the line actually is, not between good and evil, but between thinking and doing. I didn't wake up one day and decide to become a criminal. I rationalized my way there in small, reasonable-sounding steps. Each one felt harmless on its own. Together, they added up to something I can't undo. I also learned that systems aren't moral. They're procedural. They assume good faith because they have to, not because it's always deserved. When people say, "The checks and balances will catch it," what they really mean is, I hope someone else is paying closer attention than I am. Sometimes, no one is. If you're reading this and you're anywhere near that mental edge, telling yourself you're smarter than the process, that no one will really be hurt, that you'll stop once you get what you need, here's my advice: stop earlier than you think you need to. Momentum is the real trap. Once you're invested in the outcome, walking away feels more dangerous than going through with it, even when it isn't. And if you're on the other side of things, buying, trusting, signing, slow down. Ask the annoying questions. Be the person who double-checks. Not because everyone's out to get you, but because the ones who are usually sound the most reasonable. I don't tell this story for absolution. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm telling it because the scariest part wasn't the fraud itself. It was how normal I felt while doing it. And how easily I could have convinced myself to do it again. That's the part that still sticks with me.